guys, welcome to the channel. Jason here. I think we have done our final video on my old 1969 50 watt Plexi restoration. The final piece of the puzzle was to try this amp dialed down with a VARIAC, right, and see if we could get some kind of brown sounds out of this thing, right? If you followed the series of videos, I've had 4, 5, maybe 6 previous clips on the restoration of this thing. I've installed a bunch of new, old stock and vintage parts into this thing, caps, old tubes, the whole 9 yards, right? And today I finally completed a BIOS mod that allows me to switch between normal mains voltage and a VARIAC lower voltage, right, as per the EVH spec. I got the idea to put it on a switch from Dave Friedman himself, right? So one of the Tone Talk episodes, maybe a month or so ago, he was talking about this and he said, oh, well, you could put it on a switch, right? So when you're running normal mains, you've got the bias set normally, and then when you put it on a VARIAC, you could have a switch that sets the bias for the VARIAC voltage, right? And here in Australia, I'm going from 240 volts to 180, right? And at 180, I'm getting voltages through the amp that are very close, if not right on, the voltages as measured by Dave in Eddie's #1 Plexi, because he's also talked about the voltages that he measured in that very special amp, right? So today we're just going to go through some tones that I'm getting out of this thing now, right down in VARIAC mode. If you've watched the other clips, you would have heard what this thing sounds like in normal mains voltage. And I will show you on the bench how to implement this very simple trick in the bias to enable you to flick between your normal mains voltage and, say, a preset VARIAC voltage. Stick around. Dave mentioned about, setting up your Plexi for a VARIAC, putting a bias switch on it, right? And of course, with the vintage amp, you only do it if you've already got a hole drilled into the chassis. So I've been looking at my 69 50 watt here, figuring out how am I going to do this, right? And there's a huge hole here, which was for the tremolo remote foot switch. Too big, right? But I noticed there was a hole that had been already drilled into the side here. So what I've done here, right, is set up a switch that allows me to flick between two bias settings, one for 240 volts normal mains and one for 180 volts on the VARIAC, right? And the bias will automatically adjust. So when the switch is off, we have our normal bias set up here. This 47K here is a voltage divider with this 15K here, right? And that's actually setting up your bias voltage. So I'm at 240 volts here now, and I just want to show you here's our bias voltage, right, which will go to the grid. It's on the bias resistors there, the phase inverter. They go to the grid of the power tubes, right, pin 5. It's 42 volts. And if I flick my switch here, the amp's in standby at the moment, right? So I've just got a bias voltage, but no plate voltage. Then the bias voltage drops to minus 33, right? So we're lowering or reducing the amount of negative voltage on the grids, which will allow more bias current to flow. And what I'll do is I'll flip the amp over and I'll demonstrate how this thing works, right? But what I did to dial it in, you could do this a few different ways, right? All I'm doing here is paralleling in an 82K resistor on top of my 47K. That changes the voltage divider setup here with a 15K for your bias feed and drops the voltage appropriately. What I did is I used a 100K linear pot, and I just used a couple of crocodile leads and I dialed it in, right? I got 77K for the bias current that I wanted at 180 volts on the mains, right? 82K is the closest resistor. If you're doing this, you know, you could do this with a an adjustable pot on here, right? A trim pot. So you can have 2 trim pots. You know, look, I service all my own amps, right? So if I ever need to change it to a different value, I'll just do it myself. But for these 60A7 USA tubes, which I featured in the previous video on the restoration of this amp, the 82K works perfectly, right? So it's close enough. I'm going to leave it like that. So yeah, just kind of show you how to set this up. I'll flip the amp over and I'll demonstrate how it works with respect to changing the bias current. Right, got my bias probe in here. We're at 240 on the mains, and I've got the bias setting switch on the rear in the 240 mode. Let's bring this out of standby, and you see, probably going to settle here. Let's see where we go. So we've settled in at about 30 here. I had this kind of on 31, 32 before. My wall voltage has probably dropped just a touch as these things do move around. But you can see it's kind of settled in there pretty much at that point, right? If I flick this bias switch while I'm in 240, you'll see what'll happen. I'm not going to leave it on, that's for sure. But see that? I'll just flick it back again. All right, she starts climbing straight away because I've dropped the negative voltage on the grid of the power tubes, which allows far more plate current to flow at idle. Way too hot there, right? So this setting should be what we are looking for when we come back down to 180. So I'm bringing the VARIAC back now, guys. I'm back at, let me bring it in, 180. Here we go, we're at 180 right now. And you see, in the standard bias setting for 240 volts, this is now running at 21. Now if you plug these numbers into a bias calculator, down at 180 volts on the mains, my plate voltage has come down to 345 volts. All right, you plug 345 in for 60A7s, and you kind of want 43, 44 to get to 60% dissipation. So somewhere around there, or maybe a little bit over. So let me flick the bias switch up, and we're right up at 50, which I remember Dave actually said, I wrote it down when he said it on the Tone Talk. Oops. That Ed's Plexi ran at 50 milliamps at idle when set on the VARIAC, right? So we're in the right ballpark here, right? So yeah, pretty handy additional, I think, right? Allows me to kind of run this 240 or get the VARIAC out at 180, flick the switch on the back. We're happy. We obviously want to see how this thing sounds now. Okay guys, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the clip. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do hit the thumbs up, all that good stuff, right? You'll be notified of new content, and I will catch you next time.